everyone. Welcome to Just Say It, the podcast by communicators for communicators. On this show, we have in-depth conversations with journalists, messaging experts, designers, marketers, leaders, and managers, and unpack their wisdom and experience. Each episode is designed for strategic communicators looking to level up and advance their careers. I'm your host, Rochelle Bedell. Brian Sobel earned his degree in broadcast communication arts and journalism. He worked in radio and television and spent several years working for corporations as a writer, training consultant, and video producer. Brian has also served as a planning commissioner, vice mayor, and on a variety of boards and commissions for both public and private organizations, including serving on the board for the Golden Gate Bridge. Brian has published articles in the Wall Street Journal and often appeared on the History Channel and hosted a weekly talk radio program on the Northern California Radio Network. And if that wasn't enough, for over 8 years, Brian has been a part owner of a minor league baseball team that won 3 league championships. Brian currently provides political and military commentary for numerous media outlets, including KTVU, TV2 in the San Francisco Bay Area, and communications consulting services and media training to organizations and individuals throughout the Bay Area. Brian Sobel, welcome to the show. We are so excited to have you on here.
Thank you very much for having me.
So our conversation today, we're going to be talking about media interviews, being both the interviewee and the interviewer. We're going to start with the interviewer. Super excited to get into this conversation. Brian has extensive experience in this area and is a master of moving the conversation where he wants it to go. So this will be a fun one. Brian's had extensive experience with interviewing some of the greatest minds of our time, including George Herbert Walker Bush, Richard Nixon, Edward Teller, and Colin Powell, just to name a few. So Brian, can you tell us who was your most memorable interview guest and why?
Hard question to answer, Rochelle, because each interview is different. I approach each interview utilizing a great deal of preparation. I go into an interview knowing as much about that person as is possible publicly, but I really want to know the private side of somebody as well. So if you're interviewing a president, as an example, that president has been interviewed literally thousands of times. And what makes your interview with that person different? And that's the kind of thing that I think about when I'm going to interview somebody, is not a gotcha question, not a question that's different than they've ever heard before, but maybe a different slant, something different. So let me, if I may, give you an example. When I interviewed Richard Nixon, who's long past at this point, I interviewed him for a very specific reason. I was working on a book called The Fighting Pattons. So I was working with the son of the very famous General George S. Patton. Now, the son was also a general. And so it made an interesting story of continuous service to the United States from the punitive expedition chasing Pancho Villa in 1916 through the Vietnam War. That kind of continuum fascinated me. But Richard Nixon was somebody who studied George S. Patton, the father of the fellow I was spending so much time with, the younger General Patton. And so I arranged this interview with him. And I had learned through my research that at one point, George Patton and Richard Nixon actually lived in the same congressional district in Southern California. So I'm thinking to myself, hey, here's all this talk during World War II about what is going to happen to this old war horse when the war's over. What's he going to go home to the United States to do? And there was talk about him going into politics, which would have been the worst career choice he could have ever made. But that was the talk. So I said to myself, since he was living in the same district, technically registered in the same district as Richard Nixon, what did Richard Nixon think about George Patton living in the same district? So I asked him that question. And it's one of those questions that maybe he hadn't been asked before, believe it or not, out of thousands of questions, at least in the way that I asked it. And he said to me, if George Patton had come home from World War II and run for Congress in the same district as me, nobody would have ever heard of Richard Milhouse Nixon. Now, that's a very powerful statement. It was self-deprecating. I said, well, certainly, Mr. President, that isn't true. But what an interesting observation. So when I'm talking with somebody like a Richard Nixon or an Edward Teller, and for the folks here that are listening today, Edward Teller was an incredibly controversial figure. He had emigrated from Hungary during World War II. He had been one of the designers of the atomic bomb, one of the lead designers of the atomic bomb during what was known as the Manhattan Project here in the United States, and later became what was known as the father of the hydrogen bomb. So the most powerful bomb ever devised, developed, whatever. So you can imagine how controversial this person was. And I just dug into the controversy. I dug into what they knew and didn't know about an atomic explosion during World War II, about taking a world-altering weapon of mass destruction and essentially making it exponential through the use of this new technology, which gave us the hydrogen bomb. And he was very forthcoming. He was somebody who understood that his history was controversial and that he would be studied throughout history because of what he had done as a mathematical genius. But just asking him routine questions, Rochelle, like there was a feeling at the time that exploding an atomic bomb could actually light the atmosphere on fire. And his answer was, well, that was ridiculous. The only people who said that were people who didn't understand their mathematics. And that's the way he dismissed it. And then he talked about a use for atomic energy even today. And this was several years ago. And at that time, we were closing nuclear reactors and trying to move away from that. And ironically now, you're talking about people saying, hey, we ought to really look at safe uses of nuclear power because, for example, France uses it extensively to power their electrical grids and everything else. And we are trying as a country to move to alternative sources of energy, and that is one of them. And the question is, how safe is it? So each of these people that I have interviewed, and there's been hundreds of them over the years, from the entertainment industry, the military, from politics to every walk of life, every person has a unique story. And when you go into it saying this person is unique and they have a unique story, irrespective of what they may be doing in their life, it gives you an opportunity to really kind of peel back some onions and have some fun with it.
So tell me a little bit, with these interviews that you're talking about right now, if I understand correctly, you were actually researching for a book that you were writing.
Not always. For example, the Nixon interview was for the Fighting Patents, available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. The Fighting Patents book, the interview with Edward Teller, and I interviewed him more than once, by the way, was for my syndicated radio show. And by the way, when you talk about doing something like a radio show or this podcast, the key is to keep it interesting, right? And so having somebody on like Edward Teller on my radio show a couple of times just lit up the switchboard with people who wanted to argue points. He was a very popular guest.
Yeah. So my question would be, when you're doing a syndicated radio show where you're interviewing guests perpetually, how much time do you spend researching them? Because I get with a book, you're going to spend a lot of time, but with a show, you may not have as much time as you would with a book. So what does that look like?
Well, the first thing you do when you're going to do some research on somebody, especially somebody of note, you look at whether they've written anything themselves, because that gives you a pretty interesting insight as to how one views oneself. And that's important because the trick to interviewing people is to try to find a way through their armor. Everybody has armor that they put up, even in conversations with strangers or people they don't know very well. We keep our guard up all the time. My job as an interviewer is to try to worm my way beyond the defenses that people put up. And the way you do that is to know somebody as well as you possibly can. So I would look at what they had written. Didn't always have time to read everything, but I could look at it. And then what other people would say about them. So articles are written about, and then decide how I want an interview to go. So example, I'm just pulling a name out of the hat. I once interviewed a guy named Hal Blaine, was the guy who was the drummer for all kinds of major artists. And he was the drummer who actually was the drummer for the drummer in a lot of cases, because in the rock and roll industry, as I learned through Hal, he would be brought in to drum some song because he could do it twice in a row. Whereas a lot of rock and roll musicians couldn't do something twice in a row because one, they couldn't read music. And two is they just, a lot of times they had a basic beat and that sort of thing. But when you're in the studio recording music, as he was, you had to repeat it. So when he sat in for a group like the 60s pop hit, the Monkees, he was the drummer. The drummer you saw on television wasn't drumming. It was Hal Blaine. And Hal Blaine did it for the Beach Boys, and Hal Blaine did it for major artists of all sorts. He sat in, I believe, my memory tells me that he even sat in a couple of times for like Ringo Starr. So he belonged to what they called the Wall of Sound, a major operation in Los Angeles connected with Phil Spector, who was a whole other story. But Hal Blaine and a number of other fabulous musicians would come to the studio every day and work with the greatest stars on the face of the earth doing backup music, including, and I should add, including with Elvis Presley and a lot of other people. So there's Hal Blaine, whose name means nothing in the to folks, but I knew he'd be one heck of a great interview, and he sure was. He met everybody, he knew everybody, and because he was the guy who was the sound behind the sound, he was highly respected by all these famous musicians. So his stories were sort of endless.
So you research him and then you figure out what direction you want it to go. Do you talk with him about it before the interview? What's that preparation process look like?
Great question. Because he was somebody who I knew was not a household name, I had kind of a blank slate. What I wanted to do in that particular interview is help people understand that what they see and hear sometimes is not really what they're seeing and hearing. That oftentimes there are people in the television industry, in the music industry, that have other people who are doing a lot of their work for them. And people, when they buy music, just assume that the people who are playing on an album are those people. For many years in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, into the 80s, a lot of these musicians, as I was mentioning a little while ago, were not true musicians from the standpoint that they had studied music. And so I knew within all of that Hal Blaine would have some things to say about the industry. Now, what Hal never did, and I wouldn't have expected him to do it, was to criticize any of these people. He knew that a lot of them ended up coming from garages and other places, hadn't studied music, sat down at a drum and just started banging away, and they were proficient drummers, but they weren't able to replicate their sound exactly every time. And again, a studio musician is, may have to play something 5, 10, 15 times before it's accepted as the track that's going to be laid down. So it gets technical, but the point of it is that I knew I could go in a number of directions. So, I think probably halfway through the interview, and I think I interviewed him more than once as well, I started saying, hey, who was your favorite person to work with? Was it Elvis? Was it whatever? So I knew that the audience would very much be intrigued by that as well. So in mapping it out, I wanted to first explain what he was. Yeah, sure, he's a drummer, but he's one of the world's best drummers that you've never heard of. And therein lies the story.
Very interesting. So it sounds to me like when you're mapping out the content, you look at who is the person so that people will better get to understand them. Or when you're interviewing people who aren't as well known necessarily. So help people get to know your person and then look at the direction and some interesting piece of what they've done that you can explore.
Absolutely. I think before anybody sits down to interview anybody, there is preparation. And you may have a short period of time to do it or a longer period of time to do it. But I can tell you, when you're not fully prepared, it puts the onus on the interviewer to really kind of make it up as they go along. And that doesn't work very well oftentimes. And of course, there have been these celebrated interviewers who say, I don't want to know anything about the interviewee before I walk in. Yeah, okay. There aren't many of those people, are even fewer who are successful. It's tough. You have to know where you're going to go in and interview. And of course, I cut my teeth on journalism in high school and college, interviewing kids on campus, interviewing professors and teachers, whether it's San Jose State or San Francisco State, Cal, anywhere. You have your college newspapers. I worked on my college newspaper, and you learn quickly to be prepared, because if you walk in to speak with a professor about his being or her being in the news and you don't know what they're talking about, somebody like that says, you didn't really read up on this, did you? And that's the worst scenario you could have. So preparation is everything.
Great. Before we switch, because in a minute here, we're going to start looking at being interviewed. So being the person being interviewed. But before we switch, I'm going to use your question on you. Who was your favorite interview?
Now, see, you almost stumped me there. I actually think in total, it might have been somebody like, because of my military background, Jimmy Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle, again, is somebody who's probably not well known to the audience. But the United States in World War II was reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor that drove us into World War II. We were looking as a country for anything that could give us a lift, the country a lift. Our morale was down. It had been attacked. Japan was on the move. The Germans were on the move in Western Europe. It wasn't looking really good for the United States and other allied countries in 1942. The war had not yet begun to turn. When a young man named Jimmy Doolittle was tasked by the Army Air Corps, part of the Army, to lead an attack on Japanese forces. And his name was Jimmy Doolittle, led 16 planes off an aircraft carrier in 1942 to bomb Japan. And it was the first action where America struck back. All those planes went out knowing they would have to land someplace. It was a mission in many respects of no return. Some of the planes crashed, others landed safely, and the participants in those bombers had to find a way to try to get back. Many were captured, but it sent a shockwave through the American public. So by the time I interviewed Doolittle, he's in his 80s, and I didn't know what to expect when I interviewed him. And I drove down to interview him. He was living in Carmel, and I interviewed him in Carmel, and he was a remarkable person who taught me a lot. What he taught me was that in his mid-80s, he was as sharp as anybody I'd ever met. He knew every detail about everything, and he was a master at making sure that I understood his answer, and he wanted it to be precise. And so I'm going to give you a real quick example. I had asked him a basic construct question about the 8th Air Force, which he commanded at one point. And he was breaking down how it was constructed, number of wings, Air Force wings, and all of that. And I said, oh, okay, and we went on with the interview. And about a half hour later, he said, Brian, I have to correct the record. I said, what are you talking about, General? And he said, well, you remember when I said that we had, 14 planes in the 35th wing? I said, yeah. He said, actually, that number was 60. I said, what? And he said, yes. He said, precision's everything, Brian, and you needed to have the right number. This is a guy in his mid-80s, Rochelle. And when you look at his life, and he was an awardee of the Medal of Honor for that attack on Japan, which he accepted on behalf of all of the people who went on that mission. When you think about what he meant to America, and I'd invite anybody watching this to just Google Jimmy Doolittle really quickly and see what an American hero he was. He might have been one of my very favorite interviews.
What a great answer. And I love that out of every interview that you do, you find these stories that can inspire anyone in any stage of life, right? Like you pull out of people these life lessons. And I love that about your work and about what you do.
Well, again, I think we all have a story. Everybody who's going to watch this has a great personal story. And sometimes it takes somebody with some skill in interviewing to bring that story out. Some interviews are a lot easier than other interviews. And I can tell you the tougher interviews are with athletes, as an example, who are used to giving very cliched answers. To try to get through their armor, to try to get something different from them when they give pretty pat answers over and over is the challenge. Some of the people that I spent time with over the years in athletics, I was able to find a different way of interviewing them. And if I may share an example there was a fellow I got to know, but his name is Micah Ruzioni. And Micah Ruzioni was the captain of the 1980 Olympic ice hockey team, the famed ice hockey team that defeated the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, to create maybe arguably the biggest upset in sports history. What was essentially a professional team with a team of American college players to beat what was a professional, almost undefeated Soviet hockey team was unheard of. In fact, the week before they played a friendly with them and had lost like 10-1 or something, but they came back to win this game. Well, the hero of the game was Micah Ruzioni. He scored the winning goal. So he began being interviewed by just tons and tons of people, and he just became very cliched. And so when I started interviewing him, he would give me the routine answers. Oh yes, it was wonderful being in the Olympics, greatest thrill of my life, just one cliche after another. So I was sitting there in that first interview saying, well, okay, I'm going to get the same interview that everybody else, which is not what I'm here for. I'm trying to get something different. So when I felt that we had hit a point where we were getting on pretty well, I said, hey, Mike, so a number of your colleagues after the Olympics turned professional, and they went on to make money in the National Hockey League, and you didn't do that. Was that because you didn't think you had the talent, or what was the reason? He stopped and he said, I think it came down to this, Brian. He said, I could never top what I had done in the Olympics. I'd scored the winning goal in a gold medal winning effort over several days. Anything I did professionally would never top that because I didn't have the basic talent to compete at the professional level over time. And that was a very, very profound answer to the question. And it was different than he had given to other people. And I think the reason for that was I was able to open him up and then ask a fairly hard question, which is, hey, everybody was essentially cashing in. Why didn't you cash in?
I think that segues really nicely into looking at being the interviewee. What I hear from you there is that you were really able to get him to open up and be a bit vulnerable. But oftentimes as an interviewee, you may not want to get vulnerable with your audience. You may not want to provide that information to them. And I'll give you a quick example and maybe you can give me some advice here. One of the projects that we were working on for school this last semester was creating our personal branding statement. And this was a statement that would be made public on resumes, things like that. For me, as I look at my personal branding statement and my journey and where I've come from, where I am now, there's a lot of the history and culture that I was raised in that I don't necessarily want to get into, but that have absolutely played a giant role in where I am right now. And so figuring out how to tell that story without being too vulnerable or without isolating some of my audience, which I don't want to do, is a challenge. So what do you recommend in situations like that where you want to be open and vulnerable with your audience, but it may not be the best move? How do you work through that?
Well, when I'm working with clients that have interesting and different stories, I first say to them, you should never give up anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. But your audience is expecting to get to know you a little bit. So what I would say to you or to anybody who was brought up, however they were brought up, is to be as candid as you feel comfortable, but you do have to open up a little bit. So you would, perhaps in your case, you would say, hey, I was raised in a very close-knit environment with great expectations about what I was going to be as a child, as a teenager, as an adult. And some of that made me uncomfortable over time. And I learned that I wanted to do more, see more, be more. And while I cherish my upbringing, I realized that it was too constricting for me, not for everybody, but for me. And I made choices about expanding my thinking outside of the world I was living in.
That is such a profound answer. I knew I should have sent you my statement and had you help me with it. Thank you for that. So tell me, when you're preparing to be interviewed, what steps do you take beforehand? How do you prepare for these interviews? Because it sounds to me like as the interviewer, you don't necessarily reach out to your interviewee to map out where the content's going to go, where the story's going to go. So as an interviewee, oftentimes you're just kind of coming in blind. So how do you
I preach a number of things to people who will be interviewed. And it kind of starts with, again, preparation for the interview. To me, if I'm going to be interviewed and I get a phone call from somebody, or there are even people that I have been interviewed by many, many times, I still prep for it. I still think about what is it that that person could ask me, may want to ask me. I run 1,000 scenarios through my mind and I prepare as best I can for any kind of question. The second thing is it's incredibly important to know your audience, who you're going to be speaking to. So if I'm doing a national interview, I have to realize that I'm speaking to somebody in Tennessee and Michigan and Vermont and Oregon and Arizona. And what are the common elements that they all have that I can speak to so that I don't alienate anybody? And so that takes some time. If it's a talk show type of environment, I want to know how many people typically watch that show. I want to know the political bent of people who are watching that show, not because I'm going to change what I'm saying, but because I understand that I have to speak to an audience and I have to speak to people, hopefully, in a way that they'll accept and enjoy if it's something along those lines. So, knowing the audience is just absolutely critical. So again, preparation, knowing the audience, and remembering that interviews are not conversation. When I'm preparing for an interview, I'm the friendliest guy in the world, but I have an aim. I have a reason for interviewing you, and I have a certain expectation of what I think I'm going to have at the end of it. The trick for me as an interviewer and for an interviewee is to know my role. So as an interviewer, I'm going to try to get you to open up. And the way I'm going to do that is by engaging in conversation. I'm going to say, hey, more than how's your day? I'm going to try to take you down a certain road. Do you have a partner, a spouse, kids? Where do you live? What do you do for fun? And I do all of that before I ask literally my first question. 99% of the time it works. And 1% of the time it doesn't. I was doing an interview with the actor Mel Gibson one time, and he had played a fellow named Colonel Hal Moore, who had been a hero at the Battle of Ia Valley in Vietnam. And Mel Gibson had made a film called We Were Soldiers about Hal Moore's life. I started talking to Mel Gibson, who played Hal Moore, kind of in the way that I approach all interviews. Hey, how's your day going? Blah, blah, blah. Now, it turned out that later in the day, Mel Gibson was also going to be interviewed by Diane Sawyer. And Diane Sawyer was interviewing him about a different project called Passions of the Christ. And it was a very, very controversial movie. But I was there to talk to him about We Were Soldiers. I was interviewing him about that picture. So I just merely observed to try to break the ice. Well, it sounds like, Mel, you got a long day ahead of you. You got interviews, and movie is really controversial, Passions of the Christ. And he said, yeah. He said, can we just get on about doing the interview about Hal Moore? It kind of took me aback because it was like he reset the situation, which didn't usually happen to me. But I mean, I adjusted, said, oh, absolutely, let's move on. But typically, I am trying to get you into a conversation as the interviewer. Conversely, if I'm the interviewee and I'm dealing with a skilled interviewer, I know what they're doing when they say, hey, Brian, how you been? You've been busy, blah, blah, blah. Answer every question, knowing in the back of my mind that the next question may be, a much more difficult one. Or sometimes they cue you by saying, okay, so here's what I really want to talk to you about. So again, interviews are not conversations. Another tip I would leave everyone with is listen before responding. As an interviewee, we're being interviewed because we're what I call SMEs, subject matter experts. We're being interviewed for a reason. And for that reason, we believe we have to have the answers to everything. And sometimes we will embellish or answer a question that we really don't know the answer to. And that's a mistake. I always tell interviewees, it is okay to say, I don't know the answer to that question. Or I've been doing this for 10 years and you got me on that one. The ancillary promise is always, but I will be back to you later in the day with that answer. I will get you that answer. So listening carefully before responding is kind of the central point here, because we tend to listen to half the question, think we know where somebody's going, even in our personal conversations, and kind of jump the gun instead of waiting for the end of the question and taking a moment to contemplate. Believe it or not, when you contemplate as an interviewee, that actually puts pressure on the interviewer. And by the way, I do that as an interviewer as well. I'll ask a question and then wait for a response. And sometimes I don't even follow up. I just sit there and look at the person. Why? Because I know that it puts subtle pressure on them to start giving it up. And when they get done with an answer, I may not even respond. I may just sit there and kind of look at them like I'm contemplating the answer. And you know what happens? Humans want to fill the void, Rochelle. So they start talking again and they go on and they tend to say more. And that's what I'm trying to do. So as an interviewee, it's listen carefully before responding. And the next one is to tell the truth. So many times people get in trouble because in an interview, they say something that isn't factual. Good reporters go out, they check sources, they double check things. And if you're the supposed expert on something and you have just riffed, which happens a lot, it's not even telling an untruth, it's just kind of making stuff up. That comes back later as an embarrassing follow-up interview. And we see it every day in the news that occurs. So that's important. The other thing I would say is that in every industry, people use jargon. We all have our own shortcut language in whatever industry we're in. In radio and television, we use acronyms all the time. The way that you talk to somebody else to save time is to just use an acronym or acronym half. If it's government, RFPs and EIRs and things like that, we hear that in public or we read about it. We have to remember that our industry language is not anybody else's industry language. So we have to be very careful when we're explaining ourselves to avoid an acronym. And if we're going to use an acronym, we have to explain it first. If somebody was talking about government and said, we have to do a full EIR, I'm going to lose 90% of the readers or listeners, unless I say we have to do an environmental impact report, which is called an EIR. So that little bit of explanation in every industry, whether it's automotive, military, law enforcement, television, it doesn't matter. Every industry, grocery stores, they all have acronyms that the rest of us don't understand because we're not in that world. And so in the middle of an interview, you lose your audience because they can't follow what you're talking about. So avoiding of jargon is important. A couple other tips that I would leave is, to avoid what-if questions. As a reporter, I often will try to run a hypothetical question up the flagpole, as it were. Rochelle, what if you knew, there was going to be a disaster tomorrow? How would you handle that? And your answer is, wow, God, that, maybe your answer would be, well, that's, really tough, that sort of thing. The actual right answer there is, I'm going to avoid answering hypothetical questions because we have no idea whether there's going to be a problem tomorrow. If you're asking me whether we're prepared for a problem, I could say yes. And here's the way we're prepared for a problem. But what if questions are just traps? And interviewers use them all the time to trap interviewees. So when somebody says, well, what if I told you that you would be hurt tomorrow or you would lose all your money tomorrow? How would you respond? And the answer is, well, that hasn't happened. I'm not going to go there. That's the proper answer. So avoiding what if questions is important. And then in our world, you hear this no comment. I have no comment. That's the worst answer you can give because everybody has a comment. It's that you may not be able to answer the interviewer's question. And that's where you can turn the tables a little bit. Somebody asks a question you might be able to say about an employee. It's really easy to say, well, the easy answer is no comment, but I'm not going to say that to you because what I am going to say to you is much more important. And that is that every employee is protected from the abuse of information around their personal lives. It's, in fact, has spawned many, many laws. So while I'd like to comment or while I could comment, I'm not going to because this involves a personnel issue. And as you know, and that's a phrase I use often, as you know, can't comment on that and won't comment on it. They'll accept that. But a lot of times you'll hear people just say, no comment. I have no comment on that. And I always instruct them, no, that's not the right answer. Explain why you're not commenting. It's essentially no comment by not saying no comment. So that's the trick to no comment responses. Oftentimes people in the media will ask people who are being interviewed if they would be willing to quote unquote go off the record. My response to people who have asked me that hundreds of times is do not do that. Here's why. A good reporter will say, yes, I'll accept you going off the record and telling me what you know. And they will honor that. They will not publish your name connected with that piece of information. But if they're any good, and there's a lot of good ones out, they're going to go to another source and say, hey, if I told you X, would that be true or untrue? And they might say, yeah, it's true. Then, well, then I have to ask you about it. And all of a sudden what happens is that the source that provided the information in an off the record response forces somebody to say something on the record and the onion starts getting peeled. And pretty soon a good reporter has the whole story. I've done it many, many times. I've allowed people to go off the record and then gone and found 3 other people who had to corroborate what they said because I knew enough information where they just knew they had to say something.
I was just going to say, in that situation, if you're trying to get a story out without having your name associated with it, that might be a way to do it. But if you don't want the story out, that's not the way to do it.
Exactly. A lot of people, a lot of things in politics, as an example, leak all the time. I remember a very funny story from my childhood, which help me understand things. I remember having some fascination, as we all do, with, is there life in outer space? And, are we here alone in the grand universe? And did we ever get visited by flying saucers? And as a kid, I found that to be fascinating. I read a lot about it and really was interested in it. And there was a story that was circulating about the United States government had these little aliens on ice and all these other things. We've all heard the same. And my father was a very high-ranking Army officer. And I remember saying to him, hey, Dad, I was reading about these aliens and all this sort of stuff. And is it true? I asked him a direct question. Is it true? And so he looked at me and he said, hey, Brian, he said, do you think if we had little people under ice, that story could be contained for a day, for half a day, for an hour? It's the greatest story in the history of the world. There's no way that we have that ability to hide that kind of secret. So think about it. When you turn on the news and the president has had a secret meeting with his cabinet, within 20 minutes, everybody knows what was talked about. And that's the nature of secrets. They're not secret. Assume they're not secret. I've never forgotten that. because it just made sense. If you had little people under ice someplace at some secret location over 50, 60 years, a whole lot of people would know about that. And not every one of those people would keep a secret. And years later, when I would interview people that were in and around the industry of trying to make alien life and all that a kind of a moneymaker for them, they could never really explain to me how that could really be kept a secret. They would say things like, oh yeah, it's under penalty of death. I said, everything's under penalty of death. This is the greatest story ever told. Of course, people would leak. They'd have pictures, and they really couldn't explain that. It's sort of like the Kennedy assassination. I've done numerous interviews with people who were in and around Dealey Plaza on that day. I interviewed a guy named Lavelle, he was the Dallas detective who was actually, it's a very iconic photo, but he's a guy in the white Stetson hat who's walking through the basement of the Dallas Police Department, hooked up by handcuff to Lee Harvey Oswald, when a fellow named Jack Ruby stepped forward and shot Oswald in the stomach. Now, Oswald was the guy who was accused of killing John F. Kennedy. I remember this detective telling me as an example that while Oswald was declared dead at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, he said he didn't die in Parkland Hospital. He died attached to me in the ambulance going to the hospital. I saw him take his last breath. And a historical standpoint, it was fascinating to me that this guy was in two places in his life where lightning struck. He was in the harbor on a ship on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. He was there. In 1963, he's hooked up to Lee Harvey Oswald when Jack Ruby shoots the assassin of John F. Kennedy. Who do you interview that had these two seminal things happen in their life? One, you'd have a hard time finding. Two, and so those are the interviews you want to find. But that kind of thing is unrelated necessarily to going off the record. It's an interesting aside. And finally, the last thing I would say for interviewees is kind of a cruel thing to do, but good interviewer may kind of pick at a scab long enough to get a reaction. I watch people's eyes, I watch their faces, I watch the way they tap their fingers. I take in the whole body experience to see if I'm moving them at all. Any good interviewer does that, or experienced interviewer does it. I've seen interviewers who are really intimidated by the person they're interviewing, so they don't take in the whole room. They don't. Sometimes it's more difficult than others. You know, I've interviewed basketball players who are over 7 feet tall. I can't get eye-to-eye contact with them. I try to get them to sit down so that I can find some similarity there. They are very aware of their height, and they use it to their advantage in interviews. I mean, all these things are at play, believe it or not, but it goes on every day. So if I can pick at a scab, to be blunt, long enough, I may get a real reaction out of you about something because you're going to get irritated. You're going to get mad. I don't like that line of questioning. Well, you know, it's my job to ask it. I'm sorry. And then you just pick. So the rule is to keep your wits about, you know, to use the old phrase, lose your cool. It's to know that the interviewer has that as their mission when they come into the interview, is to get the most out of you that they can. And to do that, they're going to try different techniques.
As the interviewer, Brian, how do you manage the ethics of that? Like when you talk about picking at the scab or like really pushing a certain topic, for me, I have so much respect for people's stories. And I know you do too. So much respect for their stories, their privacy. I know we're there to get a story and to make an interesting interview. So how do you balance the ethics of really pushing someone where they don't want to go versus letting them tell the story that they want to tell?
Again, great question. And the answer is that I have interviewed people who I know are not experienced with the media. I am very, very careful. I've done so many interviews with people who just maybe had a horrible thing happen in their life. You know, I'm writing a story for a magazine, a newspaper, whatever. I don't have to do that. You know, I've interviewed people on death row as an example. These people have been convicted of heinous crimes. I have no sympathy for them going into the interview because of what they've done. So for an example, I spent a lot of hours on death row interviewing Richard Allen Davis. Richard Allen Davis was the person convicted of kidnapping and killing of Polly Klaas in 1993. It's hard to work up any empathy, sympathy, or anything for Richard Allen Davis. So my relationship with him was strictly business. It was strictly catching him in a series of lies because I knew as much about the case as he did, except he was a perpetrator, but the overall case. And when he would lie to me, I'd look him straight in the face and say, that's a lie. And half the time he'd laugh and go, yeah, whatever. And he'd go on about it. Point I'm trying to make is that if it's an experienced person who I'm interviewing, I conduct that interview differently than I would say of a family member who had a tragedy. It's just completely different. I'll give you a quick example. When I was a news director in radio, I had a reporter who had gone out and interviewed a relative of somebody who had committed suicide. And I'm being careful here with details. And they were doing a live report. And I happened to be driving back to the studio. The reporter said, you know, I've just spoken with the relative of the person who committed suicide. And it was a very graphic way describing what had occurred. I was really upset. And so I got back to the studio and that person came in and I said, hey, you and I have to have a chat. And I said, you were interviewing somebody who had just lost a very close relative through suicide. And you went way too far in your description of the suicide than you needed to. How about if family members were listening to this interview? I kind of said, what are you thinking about? Oh, you know, putting that light, I'm so sorry. And I said, you know, the key to life is put yourself in somebody else's footsteps, in their shoes. And when you do that, you know how to do things right when you're interviewing. Your job here was to just mention that they had passed. Details are as yet unannounced. You are reporting from the scene of a tragic situation. That was the right way to do it. So the way you did it, it was salacious. And if that person heard the interview, I expect that it'll stick with that person for the rest of their lives.
I'm hoping you might have some time to just give us a couple of tactical examples. One of the things you brought up pretty far back in the interview, I have a question about, and then I know we have another example that we wanted to run through. The first one was you had talked about talking to your different audiences. So providing the same message, but tailored to your different audiences. So I'm going to go back and use an example that you were using before. We were talking about John F. Kennedy, his assassination. And I know that we recently had Biden has released a lot of the reports and the papers surrounding that. So if you were talking about this, your typical political commentary that you do for the news, say you're talking to, I don't know, two different audiences. Do we want to divide it Republican versus Democrat? Do we want to divide it conspiracy theorists versus non-conspiracy theorists? And how do you tailor that message to say the same thing, but speak differently to those two different audiences?
So I don't always break it down, Rochelle, by political leanings. Sometimes it's just, in the case of John F. Kennedy, it's whether you believe it was a conspiracy or you don't believe it was a conspiracy.
So it sounds to me like it was actually speaking to both audiences. You wound that both sides into one so that both sides can relate to it.
I will put it into historical context, which is different than a lot of people in my industry. They will tell a story, but I will relate it. I'll give you a quick example. January 6th, the riot at the Capitol, profoundly upset, as it should have, all America. But it was portrayed as the first time there had been violence at the Capitol. And I talked on television about it was a horrible, disgusting scene. But the Capitol has seen this before. In 1954, 3 Puerto Rican men and 1 Puerto Rican woman, back before there were big security arrangements at the Capitol, went into the gallery of the House of Representatives and actually shot down onto the floor of the Capitol, wounding 3 members of Congress. We don't hear that in modern times. They wanted Puerto Rican independence. That's what they were there for. So they actually got guns into the Capitol and actually shot people on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1954. So when I was talking about January 6th and talking about terrible scenes we were seeing, I had to make sure people understood that this was a terrible event, but it's not the first time it's happened. And I think that's important for history, to remind people that, yes, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, but so was Martin Luther King, and so was Robert Kennedy. And there was an attempted assassination in that same decade of George Wallace, a third-party candidate who was paralyzed in a shopping center parking lot where he was giving a stump speech. That historical context helps people understand that what they consider one-offs, these terrible one-offs, are really a continuum of American and world history. I think that's important.
Absolutely. Just want to point out how masterful you are at describing this without alienating people. So your first statement there where you said it was a horrible, disgusting scene, it puts aside all of the reasoning behind why everybody felt that. Everybody felt it, but for different reasons. So they can all relate to that. And then they're immediately open to hearing what you have to say afterwards because you haven't alienated anyone in that statement.
Well, thank you for that. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I want people to listen to the second sentence. And if the first sentence is some declarative sentence that sets out my agenda, half of the people aren't going to listen from that point forward. So my job is to keep you interested. And if you're listening to me, I'm going to give you a little bit of history. I'm going to put it in context. I'm going to remind you that the pendulum swings continuously from one side to the other. So when people say, I've never seen it this bad, I remind them it's been bad before. The 1960s were pretty upsetting. There were race riots, there were assassinations, the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets against the Vietnam War. There was the 1968 Democratic Convention where the Chicago police beat hundreds and thousands of people to bring them to heel. So the 1960s were pretty violent. So were the 1860s and other times in American history. We talk about, well, people don't want to go to war and so, but now we're, very warlike. I say, no, let's go back into history and take a look at this.
Well, and I think we could also say the same thing about right after 9/11, but then we also know how quickly afterwards we once again became divided. We were united for about 48 hours and then we all divided on what we thought we should do next.
There are all sorts of points of view. I think in world history, see many examples of that. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, wins World War II essentially, and within weeks, his government is toppled by the electorate who were tired of the war prime minister and now wanted an economic prime minister to recover from the war. There are modern parallels. So Here was this highly popular president in Bush coming off this victory of taking a despot and kicking him out of a neighboring country. And nobody was going to run against Bush except for this governor of Arkansas who said, hey, I'll take a shot at him. And all he did is talk about the economy and how poor the economy was under Bush and how it could be improved with his plans. And he ends up president of the United States and president for 8 years. That's the way history works.
I find it absolutely fascinating. I think that's one of the great benefits to our country. And I'm going to move our conversation on in a second. But I think one of the great benefits that we see, and we see this through research too, is the benefit of diversity and having a diverse set of voices and seats at the table, because that's really where you come up with the best answers, the best solutions, when you have everybody examining and looking at all different pieces and bringing in different points of view.
I agree. I think if you look around the world now and in history, all of us is just a stable, peaceful world. And that's tough. We've never achieved it in the history of the globe.
Yeah. But let's go to our next practical example. Going back to being the interviewee, answering hard questions, something that you may not want to answer. So if you were advising someone, say someone being accused of tax fraud and knowing the media is chasing them, how would you advise the client to answer questions, including, will you release your tax returns? So how do you answer those pressing questions without saying what they want you to say or saying what you can't say or what you don't want to say?
So the first thing I'm going to remind the client is anything that's untruthful in their response will come back to bite them. Then I'm going to counsel them to explain the difficulty in answering the question. So the interviewer asks a question like, you're being accused of tax fraud. Would you be willing to release your tax returns? My advice to that person would be to say tax codes in the United States are extremely difficult. They are complicated. My tax situation is extremely complicated. We have accountants and others who are obviously taking all deductions that are legally permissible. But all in all, the discussion of tax fraud is pejorative. It is accusing me of something, or my client, that is not true and is not proven. All tax returns at a certain level are incredibly complicated. By delivering the tax returns to anybody who's not skilled at reading them and just will look at the bottom line number may not deliver the context that I think is important to help tell my client's story. The answer is I will release it at some point in the future, but in a contextual way so that people can understand it. But that's not today.
Such a great answer. I feel like I could go down a whole nother rabbit hole with you on that one. And I love that you leaned into, the professionals are looking at this, they're working through this, these are complicated things and we're working through it. We have 2 final questions. These are questions that we want to ask at the end of each of our interviews. So we'll start with the first one, which is, if you could give one piece of advice to your younger self when you were just getting going in your career, what would it be?
Maybe listen more. I thought I was a good listener, but I'm amazed that in looking back, how smart I was then and how not so smart I am now. And that's the way life is. We think we're really smart in the beginning. And then as life throws us some curveballs and we learn more, all of a sudden we realize, hey, I've got a lot to learn. So even today, as we speak, I've got so much to learn. So I would tell my younger self, hey, you've got a lot to learn, keep absorbing and don't think you know it all.
Yeah, I absolutely feel that one. For me, I think I would also lean into study more. It's not just listening, but really, really open up and look at all these different areas.
And I would say be open to other people's opinions. It's just huge.
All right. So our second question, what is one habit that you do daily that you would recommend to our listeners?
I want to start my day knowing what has gone on overnight around the world. Includes reading 3 or 4 papers very early in the morning, listening to diverse points of view in the media so that I can appreciate and try to walk in other people's footsteps. That's what I try to do first thing every morning. Then I feel like, Rochelle, I'm prepared for the day, so that when somebody calls me at 1 o'clock and says, hey, what did you think about that story that broke overnight? I don't have to make it up. I'm on top of it.
Well, Brian, thank you so much. I feel like I could talk to you for hours. It's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure.
Great chatting with you. Wish you the best of luck. And I know we'll be talking soon.
Sounds good. Before you go, let me just remind our listeners that Brian Sobel provides communications consulting services and media training and political analyst services and commentary. Brian, where can our listeners find you?
Find us at Sobel, S-O-B-E-L, communications, all one word, plural.com, and you can read all sorts of things there.
All right. Thank you so much, Brian. We will talk to you again soon.
Take care.
We have additional resources and links in our show notes at justsayitcommunications.com. Transcripts are up on the website and the video is up on YouTube. My team is Andrea Casas-Tapete, Zara Momini, and Shinga Yoshimine. And my name is Rochelle Bedell. If you enjoyed this show, please like and share it. And don't forget to apply what you learn on the show. We hope you'll join us again soon for another conversation.